me and asked me to write something and told me that the theme is Stonewall 50. I knew what I had to write. This is called Stonewall 50 and Before. In 1966, 3 members of the Genovese crime family pulled their resources together and bought the Stonewall Inn, a sleepy restaurant that catered to straight customers at 5150 Christopher Street in New York City's famed Greenwich Village. Despite the citywide campaign to rid the city of gay bars that had started earlier in the 60s, the mafia owners immediately turned the inn into a gay bar. The bar was a mess. There was no running water behind the bar. There were no fire exits. The commodes ran over almost every day. Once a week, police officers wandered into the bar to collect envelopes stuffed with payoff because the inn had no liquor license. But it was the only bar in New York City that allowed same-sex couples to dance, and so it attracted the gay boys and the gender-fluid folks like moths to a flame. Police raids on gay bars in those days seemed to be a naturally occurring phenomenon. Bars were routinely raided at least once a month, their liquor seized, and patrons harassed and arrested along with the bar's staff. The Stonewall was raided as often as any other bar in New York City. This time would be different. At 1:20 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, June 28, 1969, 4 plainclothes policemen, a detective, and a deputy inspector from the Public Morals Squad stormed into the Stonewall, announcing, "Police, we're taking the place," announcing their intention to close the Stonewall for good. Patrons who had never been in a police raid were scared and confused. The ones who were veterans of other raids ran to the window and to the front door. But the police had barricaded the window and the door. 205 patrons and staff were trapped inside this bar. However, the raid did not go according to the policeman's program. As typical of all such raids, some of the drag queens and transgender folks were the first arrested. The police permitted those who weren't arrested to leave through the front door. But instead of going home or wandering off to another bar, those patrons, some 150 of them, stayed and crowded around the front door. Soon, other gay folks who were out walking around the village joined in. As tensions rose, an officer shoved a drag queen, who responded by hitting him over the head with her purse, and the crowd began to yell. One African-American, self-described Butch Dyke, who was roughed up, who was roughed up and put into one of the patrol cars, yelled at the crowd, "Why don't you guys do something?" That was when the crowd turned into a mob, and the scene exploded. Soon patrons were throwing pennies at the cops, then beer bottles. They overturned one of the patrol cars and slashed the tires on another one. The cops, having chased all the patrons out of the bar, were themselves now trapped inside, with hundreds of enraged queens blocking the door. I love this. And thus began 3 nights of rioting, with hundreds rioting that shocked the cops, stunned the nation, and empowered the LGBTQ community in New York City to gather their resources for the coming fight. The drag queens, the transgender women, the street kids who lived in Christopher Park across the street, bystanders who suddenly were bystanders no more, have all joined the pantheon of LGBTQ heroes and heroines. On June 24, 2016, President Barack Obama, remember him? President Barack Obama announced the creation of the Stonewall National Monument, putting the inn, the Christopher Street Park across the street, and the 7.5 acres surrounding the inn under the supervision and protection of the National Park Service. And just last month, the city announced that 2 of the transgender women of color who battled at the front of the clash, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, will be honored with a monument saluting their bravery during the riots and their leadership roles in the gay liberation movement that was started at Stonewall. Oops, big mistake. I just plunged headlong into the prevailing but mistaken narrative that the gay liberation movement started at Stonewall. Just as it is not true that the Queens rioted to express their grief over Judy Garland's burial earlier that day, it is equally untrue to say that the gay liberation movement began with the Stonewall riots. Decades earlier, in 1948, 21 years before Stonewall, Harry Hay, a diehard communist, a diehard communist living in Los Angeles, established the Mattachine Society, a rather conservative group by our standards. They sought the peaceful assimilation of LGBTQ folks into society at large. Once a year, I've seen these pictures and they're wonderful. Once a year, for several years, Harry and other Mattachine members quietly picketed in front of the White House on July 4th. The men in stiffly starched, thin black ties, the women in appropriate knee-length A-line skirts and button-down blouses. In 1955, 14 years before Stonewall, San Franciscans Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, who had been lovers for 3 years at the time, started the Daughters of Bilitis, the very first lesbian civil rights organization in the country. Their names still grace the Lyon Martin Health Services Center here in San Francisco. Now, neither the Mattachine Society nor the Daughters of Bilitis was exactly act up in their approach or their impact, but their contributions to gay liberation must always be remembered. We must also remember the riot here in San Francisco at Compton's Cafeteria. For many years, Compton's Cafeteria at 101 Taylor Street was one of the few places in the city where transgender people, especially the trans women who had been hustling all day, could congregate publicly. Shamefully, transgender people were still not welcome in gay bars due to obvious transphobia. Convinced that the drag queens and the transgender women were loitering too long and driving away other more respectable customers, Compton's management and staff routinely called the police when the transgender women were present, causing them to suffer harassment and arrest for a crime called female impersonation. In response to police arrests, the transgender community picketed Compton's. The picket, though, was unfruitful. Compton's continued harassing the transgender women in their cafeteria, but this picket was worth remembering. It was the very first demonstration against police violence toward the gay community. It deserves to be remembered for that. I spent hours searching in vain for the date of the Compton's Cafeteria riot, only to find out that no one is exactly sure when it happened. It turns out police records from the 1960s no longer exist, and none of the newspapers, not even the San Francisco dailies, covered the riot. We know that on an otherwise nondescript August night in 1966, 3 years before the Stonewall uprising, after Compton's management called the cops again, one transgender woman resisted by throwing coffee in his face.
Yes, yes.
The drag queens and transgender women poured out into the street, fighting the cops with their high heels and heavy purses. Dishes were hurled across the cafeteria, furniture was broken up and either thrown around or used as weapons, and the rioters busted the front glass window into shards. They shattered police car windows and torched a couple of sidewalk newsstands. On the following night, the Tenderloin Street people and other members of the gay community joined in another picket of the cafeteria. Because Compton still would not allow transgender women into their cafe. The demonstrators, in turn, destroyed the newly installed plate glass windows. The Compton's cafeteria riots marked a major shift in the LGBT movement proliferation. As a result of the riot at Compton's, activists created a network of social, psychological, and medical support services for transgender people. In 1968, local talents created the National Transgender Counseling Unit, the first peer-run support and advocacy organization in the country. Some 7 years even before the Compton's riots, in May 1959, a smaller riot broke out in Los Angeles at the Cooper Donuts shop. Drag queens, lesbians, gay men, and transgender people who hung out at Cooper Donuts frequently faced harassment from the LAPD. On this particular night, patrons fought back when police stormed in and arrested 3 people, including the author and well-known hustler, John Rashi, who wrote about the riot. He wrote about the riot in his autobiographical work, City of Night.
Yes.
Patrons began pelting the police with donuts and coffee cups. I'm sorry, that is just too funny an image. Drag queens throwing donuts at cops. The LAPD called for backup and arrested several of the rioters. Remember, this was 1959, 10 years before Stonewall. Now, having reviewed these pre-Stonewall uprisings, I certainly don't mean to diminish or play down the singular importance of Stonewall in our collective history. Far from it. Stonewall was the first LGBTQ riot of that size and that duration. It was reported in newspapers across the country, and its impact has been felt worldwide. It will never be forgotten. It will always be rightfully celebrated this time of year. But to be true to our history, to be true to ourselves, it is important that we recognize that the Compton's cafeteria riots and the Cooper Donuts riot also played a significant role in the gay liberation movement. And thus, to all the drag queens and transgender women, all the street punks and street hustlers and gay punks in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York City, who stood nose to nose with some of the most vicious, bigoted cops in the country and refused to back down.
Yes.
To them, I say thank you. Even as we celebrate Stonewall 50, we will never let the rest of you be erased from our history. Thank you.
Thank you.